It was just another ordinary morning in the small town of Crestwood. Or so it seemed. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and the streets were quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you think nothing out of the ordinary could possibly happen. But that's the thing about life. It has a way of flipping the script when you least expect it. And on this particular day, the script was about to be flipped in a way no one in that town would ever forget. It all started with a routine traffic stop. A black SUV was pulled over by two police officers for what appeared to be a minor violation. The driver, a poised and confident black woman, stepped out of the vehicle, her demeanor calm but firm. The officers, unaware of who they were dealing with, approached her with the kind of authority that suggested they'd done this 100 times before. But this time, things were about to go very differently. The woman, whose name was Dr. Evelyn Carter, was no ordinary citizen. She was a high-ranking official at the Pentagon, a key figure in national security, and someone who had spent her career navigating the most complex and high-stakes situations imaginable. But here she was, standing on the side of a quiet road, in Crestwood, being questioned over what seemed like a trivial matter. The officers, perhaps influenced by unconscious bias, or simply following protocol, began to escalate the situation. They asked for her license and registration. But when she calmly explained that she was on official government business, they didn't believe her. Instead, they accused her of resisting and being uncooperative. What followed was a series of events that would leave everyone involved, and eventually, the entire courtroom, stunned. As the situation escalated, Dr. Carter remained composed, her years of training and experience kicking in. She knew her rights, and she knew the law. But the officers, convinced they were dealing with someone who was trying to deceive them, decided to take her into custody. Handcuffs were placed on her wrists, and she was led to the patrol car. The scene was surreal. A woman of her stature, someone who had dedicated her life to serving her country, being treated like a common criminal. But Dr. Carter wasn't panicking. In fact, she was already thinking several steps ahead. She knew this wasn't just about her. It was about something much bigger, and she was determined to see it through. Word of the arrest spread quickly through the small town, and by the time Dr. Carter was brought to the local courthouse, the room was packed with curious onlookers. The judge, a no-nonsense figure who had seen it all, took his seat and called the case to order. The prosecution, confident in their evidence, began to lay out their case. But as they spoke, something felt off. The charges didn't add up, and the more they talked, the more it became clear that they had no idea who they were dealing with. Dr. Carter, now standing before the judge, waited for the right moment to speak. And when she did, the entire room fell silent. She introduced herself not just as Dr. Evelyn Carter, but as a senior official at the Pentagon, someone with top-level security clearance and a role in shaping national policy. The prosecution froze. The judge leaned forward, his expression a mix of shock and disbelief. Even the officers who had arrested her looked uneasy, realizing the gravity of their mistake. But Dr. Carter wasn't done. She began to explain the real reason she was in Crestwood, a reason that had nothing to do with a traffic violation and everything to do with a mission so critical it could change the course of history. The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone was on the edge of their seats, waiting to hear what she would say next. But just as she was about to reveal the truth, the judge raised his hand, stopping her mid-sentence. What happened next would leave the entire courtroom in shock. The prosecution, scrambling to save face, tried to argue that her position didn't exempt her from the law. But the judge, now fully aware of the situation, wasn't having it. He turned to Dr. Carter and asked her a single question, a question that would change everything. And as she prepared to answer, the screen faded to black, leaving the audience hanging on the edge of their seats. What was the question? What was Dr. Carter's mission? And how would this unexpected turn of events impact not just her, but the entire town of Crestwood? The answers were coming, but not yet. For now, All anyone could do was wait, their minds racing with possibilities, their hearts pounding with anticipation. This was just the beginning. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above. All eyes were on Dr. Evelyn Carter as she stood tall, her presence commanding the room despite the handcuffs that still restrained her. The judge's question hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and charged with tension. "Dr. Carter," he began, his voice steady but laced with curiosity, "can you explain to this court why a high-ranking Pentagon official would be in Crestwood, of all places, and under such unusual circumstances?" Dr. Carter took a deep breath, her mind racing. She knew this was the moment to choose her words carefully. The truth was far more complicated than anyone in that room could imagine, and revealing too much too soon could jeopardize everything. But she also knew she had to say enough to make them understand this wasn't just about her. It was about something much larger. "Your Honor," she began, her voice calm but firm, "I understand how this must look, but I assure you, my presence here is not a coincidence. I'm here on official government business, and the details of that business are classified. What I can tell you is that this situation, this misunderstanding, has the potential to interfere with a matter of national security." The room erupted in murmurs. National security? In Crestwood, the small town was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the biggest news was usually a high school football game or a bake sale. The idea that something so monumental could be happening right under their noses was almost too much to process. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order, but even he looked unsettled. "Dr. Carter," he said, leaning forward, "you're asking this court to take a lot on faith. If what you're saying is true, then we need more than just your word. We need proof." Dr. Carter nodded. She had anticipated this. Reaching into her pocket, a move that made the officers tense up, she pulled out a small, sleek badge emblazoned with the seal of the Department of Defense. She handed it to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. The room watched in silence as the judge examined it, his expression growing more serious by the second. "This appears to be authentic," he said finally, his voice low. "But it still doesn't explain why you're here, in this town, at this time." Before Dr. Carter could respond, the prosecutor, a sharp-eyed man named Greg Harris, jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this could be a ploy. We have no way of verifying her claims without more information, and until we do, I move that we proceed with the charges." The judge frowned, clearly torn. On one hand, Dr. Carter's credentials were hard to ignore. On the other, the prosecutor had a point. The law was the law, and without concrete evidence, he couldn't just dismiss the case. Dr. Carter, sensing the judge's hesitation, decided to take a calculated risk. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but urgent, "I understand the need for due process, but I'm asking you to consider the bigger picture. If you allow this to go any further, it could have serious consequences, not just for me, but for this town, and possibly for the entire country. I'm not at liberty to say more, but I can assure you, this is not a game. Lives are at stake." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words sinking in. Even the prosecutor looked uneasy now, though he tried to hide it. The judge leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of concentration. He was clearly wrestling with a decision that went far beyond the usual traffic violations and petty disputes he dealt with on a daily basis. Finally, he spoke. "Dr. Carter, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt, for now, but I need more than just assurances. I need something concrete. If you can provide that, I'm willing to reconsider this case. If not, we proceed as planned." Dr. Carter nodded, her mind already working on a plan. She knew she had to act fast. But before she could say anything, the doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. Everyone turned to see a man in a dark suit striding in, his face grim. He was holding a folder in one hand and a cell phone in the other. and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. The bailiff moved to stop him, but the man flashed a badge and kept walking until he reached the front of the room. "Your Honor," he said, his voice urgent. "My name is Agent Mark Reynolds with the FBI. I need to speak with Dr. Carter immediately. This case is far more complicated than it appears, and time is of the essence." The judge's eyes widened, and the murmurs in the room grew louder. The prosecutor looked like he was about to object, but the judge held up a hand to silence him. "Agent Reynolds," he said, his voice cautious. "Can you explain what's going on here?" Agent Reynolds hesitated, glancing at Dr. Carter before answering. "Your Honor, I'm afraid I can't go into details. What I can tell you is that Dr. Carter's presence in Crestwood is part of a highly sensitive operation. The charges against her are a misunderstanding, and pursuing them could jeopardize an investigation that's been months in the making. I'm here to request that this case be dismissed immediately." The room erupted into chaos. People were talking over each other, some demanding answers, others speculating wildly. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, but it took several minutes to restore order. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm. "This is highly unusual to say the least, but given the circumstances, I'm inclined to grant Agent Reynolds' request. On one condition. Dr. Carter, you will remain in Crestwood until we can get to the bottom of this. If what you and Agent Reynolds are saying is true, then we need to know why. And if it's not..." He trailed off, leaving the threat unspoken. Dr. Carter nodded, her expression unreadable. She knew this was far from over. The judge's decision had bought her some time, but it had also raised more questions than answers. Why was the FBI involved? What was the operation she was supposedly part of? And why had it brought her to Crestwood, of all places? The answers were out there, but finding them would mean diving deeper into a mystery that was growing more dangerous by the minute. As the courtroom emptied, Dr. Carter and Agent Reynolds exchanged a quick, knowing glance. They didn't have the luxury of time. Whatever was happening in Crestwood, it was bigger than any of them had anticipated. And as they stepped out into the fading afternoon light, one thing was clear. The real story was just beginning. But what that story was, and how it would end, remained to be seen. For now, all they could do was move forward, one step at a time, into the unknown. As Dr. Evelyn Carter and Agent Mark Reynolds stepped out of the courthouse, the weight of the situation pressed down on them like a storm cloud ready to burst. The small town of Crestwood, usually so quiet and predictable, now felt like a powder keg waiting to explode. The two exchanged few words as they walked to a nondescript black sedan parked a block away. Inside, the tension was palpable. Reynolds started the engine, but didn't pull out immediately. Instead, he turned to Dr. Carter, his expression a mix of frustration and concern. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. "What the hell happened back there? You were supposed to stay under the radar. Now the whole town knows something's up." Dr. Carter sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I didn't plan for this, Mark. The traffic stop was unexpected. I tried to handle it discreetly, but the officers weren't having it. Things escalated faster than I could control." She paused, her mind racing. "But that's not the real problem. The fact that I was detained means someone's onto us. This wasn't just bad luck. Someone tipped them off." Reynolds frowned, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "You think there's a leak?" "I don't think I know," she replied, her voice steady but urgent. "This operation was supposed to be airtight. Only a handful of people knew I was coming here. If the local police were waiting for me, it's because someone told them to be. And if that's the case, then we're not just dealing with a small-town conspiracy. This goes higher than we thought." Reynolds nodded, his jaw tightening. He knew she was right. The mission they were on was too important to risk exposure. Crestwood might have seemed like an unlikely place for a national security threat, but that was exactly what made it the perfect cover. The town was a hub for a sophisticated smuggling operation, one that had ties to international networks. Dr. Carter had been sent in to gather intel and dismantle it from the inside. But now, with her cover blown, the entire operation was in jeopardy. As they drove through the quiet streets, Reynolds filled her in on what he'd learned since arriving in town. "I've been tracking a few key players," he said, keeping his eyes on the road. "There's a local businessman, Thomas Greer, who's been flying under the radar for years. On paper, he's clean. But my sources say he's the one pulling the strings. He's got connections everywhere. Local government, law enforcement, even a few federal agencies. If anyone could have tipped off the cops about you, it's him." Dr. Carter listened intently, her mind piecing together the puzzle. "Greer," she repeated, committing the name to memory. "What do we know about him?" "Not enough," Reynolds admitted. "He's careful, too careful. But there's something else. A few days ago, I intercepted a coded message. It mentioned a package arriving in Crestwood this week. No details, but the timing lines up with your arrival. Whatever's going on, it's big, and it's happening soon." The car fell silent as the gravity of the situation sank in. Dr. Carter stared out the window, watching the town pass by. Crestwood looked so ordinary, so innocent, but beneath its quaint surface, something dark was brewing, and she was right in the middle of it. Meanwhile, across town, Thomas Greer sat in his lavish office, his fingers steepled as he listened to the report from one of his men. The news of Dr. Carter's arrest had reached him within minutes, and he wasn't pleased. "This is a problem," he said, his voice calm but laced with menace. "She's not just some random visitor. If she's who I think she is, then we've got a serious situation on our hands." The man standing before him shifted uncomfortably. "We didn't know, sir. The cops acted on their own. By the time we found out, it was too late." Greer's eyes narrowed. "That's not good enough. We can't afford mistakes. Not now. Not when we're so close." He stood, pacing the room as he thought. "Find out everything you can about her, who she is, why she's here, and who she's working with. And keep an eye on the courthouse. If she talks, we're finished." Back in the car, Reynolds pulled into the parking lot of a small motel on the edge of town. It was the kind of place that didn't ask questions, which made it perfect for their needs. As they got out, Dr. Carter glanced around, her instincts on high alert. "This is where you've been staying?" she asked, her tone skeptical. "It's not the Ritz, but it's safe," Reynolds replied, leading her to a room on the second floor. Inside, the space was sparse but functional. A laptop sat open on the table, surrounded by stacks of files and maps. Dr. Carter immediately went to work, scanning the documents for anything that might help them. As the hours passed, the two of them pieced together what they could. The smuggling operation was more extensive than they'd realized, with ties to organized crime and even foreign governments. The package Reynolds had mentioned was likely a shipment of high-tech weapons, the kind that could tip the balance of power in the wrong hands. And it was due to arrive in Crestwood in less than 48 hours. But the more they learned, the more questions they had. Who was behind this? How deep did the corruption go? And most importantly, how could they stop it without blowing their cover completely? Dr. Carter knew they were running out of time. Every move they made was being watched, and one wrong step could be catastrophic. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the room, Dr. Carter turned to Reynolds. "We need a plan," she said, her voice firm. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to make the next move. We need to take control of this situation before it's too late." Reynolds nodded, but before he could respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. "It's from one of my contacts," he said, his voice tense. "They've spotted Greer's men near the courthouse. They're looking for you." Dr. Carter's heart raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Then we don't have much time," she said, her mind already racing through the possibilities. We need to move fast, but we also need to be smart. One misstep, and this whole thing falls apart. The room fell silent as the two of them strategized, the stakes higher than ever. Outside, the town of Crestwood slept, unaware of the danger, lurking in its shadows. But for Dr. Carter and Reynolds, there was no rest. The clock was ticking, and the real battle was just beginning. What would happen next was anyone's guess. But one thing was certain: nothing in Crestwood would ever be the same again.